I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. What's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like. I mixwhatilike.org, at I Mix What I Like for all your relevant social media. Once again, of course, I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your host. And I'm very excited to have a conversation, long overdue, with this brother and about a topic that we are always excited to talk about, the concept of Pan-Africanism. And we're going to be joined in this segment by Professor Baruti Katembo, who is an independent scholar, has formerly served as a college mathematics faculty member, is author of several articles and book publications, including Scattered Assets, and is a co-author with Doctors David Okombo and Kemet Shockley of a very important book called Uwenzi, The Pan-African Factor, a 21st Century View. Dr. Baba, Professor, Brother Baruti Katembo, welcome to the program. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
So we had originally intended to have all the authors on to talk with us about the book, so we'll just consider this a part one of several discussions. And of course, as I said, our conversations around Pan-Africanism are ongoing anyway, so that fits perfectly. But if you would lay out for us, from your perspective, what is the intent behind this book, what your goals were with this book, and what it seeks to do in, again, as you all call out, the 21st century.
Well, actually, this book is really written as kind of an overview for just the masses of people, regardless of their professional backgrounds and their interests, but is to just acquaint people with practical to-dos, practical understandings of Pan-Africanism, or we call it the Pan-African factor or Pan-African development. And when we talk about this in terms of working definition, we're talking about the interlink and cross usage of African peoples, resources, interests, ideas across oceans, borders, and regions. So we're looking at an interactive exchange. And one of our emphases in the book is to talk about the reciprocal need of the African diaspora with the continent to be resources for each other, not simply a look from the diaspora toward the continent to say, what is the continent doing? Is the continent developing? Are people on the continent making linkages between countries, but how we all as African people are interactively using each other as resources, trying to reconnect.
So I think you brought us there, but just so we're even maybe more clear, when you say Pan-Africanism and you refer to the continent and the diaspora, what exactly do you mean by Pan-Africanism, and what is this connection that you see and that you would encourage others to see or to develop upon even?
Well, again, when we talk about Pan-African development, we're talking about participatory linkages, where we're utilizing each other as resources. For example, let's take, for example, as one great idea of a resource. Suppose that we're looking at expanding ecotourism and conference tourism on the continent, in terms of building better capacities for people to visit, to go on conferences, and then when they go on conferences for various organizations, they want to expand to do tours, etc. Let's say there are not enough African American people that are doing these types of things. We want to expand the capacity. We also want to expand the capacity for people outside of a given country. It could be the country of Zambia, for example, or Namibia. We want people from surrounding areas to come and visit. Well, in this particular case, why couldn't the resources, say, of some of your historically Black colleges, particularly some of the research-oriented ones, could be Morgan State, could be North Carolina A&T, Howard University, Hampton University, Florida A&M, just as selected branch of those professors who are in the STEM areas and business areas, working with universities in said given African countries to help facilitate the expanse of such a program where we're getting more African American people going to the continent, more people from other countries visiting the continent. And in exchange for those great minds working together, perhaps the increase in the revenue we might see in terms of the country's economy, some of that revenue might be shared with some of those institutions that help to work to build that capacity. So we're talking about linking not only institutions, but our people in general as resources toward each other. So that's one practical example that hopefully might go to some of the idea about the Pan-African development, but it's really linking us together for the point of developing us wherever we are.
So, as we exchanged a little bit before for this interview, I had a couple of concerns or questions about the direction you all were taking with the book, and this is I think a good way for me to raise one of them. So, for instance, when we talk about a greater exchange between Africans in the United States or African Americans and the diaspora with the continent, one of the first things that I have to that I always am concerned about. Well, one, let me just start by saying I adhere to a form of Pan-Africanism as I understand it. The form promoted most popularly by Kwame Nkrumah or Kwame Ture, a united Africa under scientific socialism. I also, broadly speaking, the concept of all African descendants are indeed African people, even those of us over here, even those of us maybe more set apart by in terms of complexion or particular heritage. But to the extent that any of us are Black or descendants of Africa, we are Africans with a common history, common culture, and should have a common political destiny. But the first thing I think when I hear, for instance, the examples you brought up, one is that African Americans or Africans in America don't have any resources. That this is one of the things that is a pet peeve of mine, that we greatly misunderstand how many resources we actually have, that we don't have a lot of money. We don't have a lot of potential we're cut out of the economy in such an extent we can't fully engage. And on a macro level, so is the continent of Africa, being still shackled economically and in terms of policy and in terms of military to Western empire in most cases. And then in terms of HBCUs, as we know, HBCUs are not themselves revolutionary institutions. And they're not often in the case fully in control or run by African or African descended people with this kind of particular interest or political interest. So in other words, so sort of what I wanted to ask you about is, how do you all in your book address the development of a Pan-African consciousness, which some of us might argue is necessary to reach in advance of developing some of the plans and ideas that you all suggest? And anything else that you want to respond to in what I've said, please do.
Okay. Well, first of all, the idea of Pan-Africanism really, the idea is really old and actually conceptually simple, regardless as to whether or not the term was coined or being used or at what time. And that basically is simply connecting Black people wherever we live. So we just go with the fundamentals, the word pan meaning all, or sometimes across, but all, and then Africa representing Black people, all Black people, or across the world in which we may live. Okay, so with that idea in mind, let me just start with our co-authored book that you mentioned. The name Uwenzi, the Pan-African Factor, 21st Century View. The word Uwenzi itself is a Kiswahili term that means cooperation. So the basis of the book is that cooperation has got to be the basis under which we get together to move mountains or to complete tasks. Now, on the front cover of the book, there's actually a picture of several giraffes that are at a watering hole. And the reason that we use the picture of a giraffe is because the giraffe is actually symbolic of being a sentinel or something that is watchful or mindful. Why is that? Because giraffes actually look out for one another. While some of them are drinking water from a watering hole, the other giraffes are actually acting as sentinels. Because of the tall height of the giraffe, they can see from far distances and have an acute sense of when danger is present. So much so that other animals, such as antelopes or other kinds of impalas or other kinds of animals, actually wait for the giraffes to move to signal to them when danger is. Now, why is this important? Because what we're trying to talk about is cooperation amongst our people is a valuable resource in moving forward. Now, you mentioned in terms of just the book itself, we have three authors, three African people, three Black men that worked on this book from different academic and professional backgrounds. That's number one, working in consortium to produce a product. We weren't in the same states at all. Florida for me, Kemet Shockley, Washington, D.C. area, Dr. Combo in Mississippi. We had to move around monies. We had to share time, resources, energies, efforts, research. So to get this book done, we had to exhibit Pan-African ideas even for that with cooperation and understanding of a purpose and a goal, we can move things forward. Now, having said that, you mentioned that we don't seem to have lots of resources. Well, first of all, we shouldn't look at resources, and I'm not suggesting that you did, but I'm saying in general, we shouldn't look at resources as simply money. Money is one component of a resource, but a resource is simply a tool. So if we talk about resources, which we do in the book, we talk about hard resources and soft resources. Hard resources may be money, maybe physical infrastructure. Soft resources may be knowledge, maybe ideas about management skills, other sorts of ideas about intuition, resourcefulness. So, for example, the issue of dual citizenship, which is something that I think is needed for interested Africans in the diaspora with various African nations, could be a source of interconnection, because where we might not as a group have lots of money individually, we collectively might have not only monies collectively, but we also may have certain talents that would be useful in sort of the remanagement of certain things or the work with various African countries on various things. So when I mentioned to you about HBCUs engaging in certain research projects, various HBCUs have an undercapacity of utilization of their researchers to be able to do a whole lot of things. An example that I gave you about the ecotourism or conference tourism, those are things that can be working on planning. It might not take a lot of money, it just may take the mindset to say, how can we make this happen to increase tourism? So to the point that since the HBCUs would have, in this particular scenario, been working with these various African countries, they can get a certain percentage of the monies that come in as an additional growth. So we're going to have to find creative ways to do this, but the whole idea is that we want to be engaged. I don't think that we're engaged enough, and I don't think that the idea about cooperation is really emphasized. A lot of times people talk about, how much money, how much infrastructure, but there are other aspects that can that I think can be very beneficial.
So Oh, I appreciate that, and I think I get that. But again, so when I responded to you all with what I thought I wanted to ask you about, I was wanting to ask, again about the various traditions of Pan-Africanism, understanding that there are competing forms or variations, and was wondering where the political social movement aspect of Pan-Africanism figures in your work. That is, because I remember at one point in the book, you all were talking about the potential for greater involvement in global exchange, global economies, with trade deals with Southern Sudan and Israel as a potential suggestion that was raised, and things of that nature. And again, I was wondering, where do these competing or various forms of Pan-Africanism fit into this? Because even if there was to be a greater engagement with the global economy still is capitalist, imperialist, demands poverty and inequality in various parts of the world. How does greater engagement with that assure a sort of benefit to the African collective, which is what I think most of us would assume is the ultimate goal of any Pan-African effort, the collective. So in other words, instead of just building up, another, African elite through tourism or business, how do we assure politically, ideologically, that the wealth that is generated, A, is redistributed, and B, may be generated in a way that doesn't harm the planet and humanity and labor in the way that wealth is generated today?
Well, again, our book was kind of written in a way in which we're talking about the concept of, cooperation as the basis of, Pan-African development, not a critique or necessarily a parallel of the issues about whether we're going to deal with scientific socialism, whether we're going to deal with the philosophies on Pan-Africanism of Steve Biko, or whether it be Kwame Nkrumah, Marcus Garvey, etc. And I think there are all kinds of ideas about Pan-Africanism, but the whole thing is, are we trying to reconnect Black people for a greater good, with Africa being in the mix as a recognition of our, original spiritual and cultural homeland, even if various components of the family, so to speak, are dispersed throughout the globe. So you mentioned the issue about Israel and a few other countries, trading with African nations. And the reason that was put into the book was, we're talking about, in that particular chapter, it was talking about self-sufficiency technologies. Okay, so for example, if you take the Scandinavian countries, whether it be Norway, Sweden, a lot of them, many of them have done fantastic work in regard to using replenishable energy, whether it be wind, solar, hydroelectric or water power. Okay, now these are replenishable technologies. So with various African countries, they need to be involved in using the resources that are there that are replenishable. So if you are talking about an exchange of those kind of technologies, that will engage in self-sufficiency, because we're not talking about the giving out or the use necessarily of resources that are non-replenishable. Gold, diamonds. We're talking about Africa has a lot of water, sun is abundant, wind is abundant in various places. So the investment in certain kinds of technologies to maximize what Africa already has is very, very important. So, for example, I was just reading an article based upon an interview we're going to have today, that there's a company in Israel called WaterGen, water and then -GEN for water generation, WaterGen. And basically, they're engaged in products that pretty much are able to produce water from the air. Okay, so therefore, this would be ideal in various African countries to invest in this. Why? Because 40% of people living in various regions of Africa live in water-challenged areas, either scarcity of water or where water is not, clean drinking water. So you need clean drinking water as a basic premise to start any civilization and to have a flourishing one. So the investment of this kind of technology in exchange might be very helpful, in this regard, because we're talking about self-sufficiency technologies. Okay, so that's why, and then if we talk about self-sufficiency technology, once you get any kind of technology and someone provides you with the technology, you're going to have to continue to maintain it. Well, this is an area right here where we need to combine forces. As I told you, some of the HBCUs with some of the colleges on the continent, the scientists get together, take some of those products that they could get from the technology exchange, break those down, customize it, figure out a better way to use them in Africa for the betterment. Now, for example, with this idea about just the technology piece, water, sun, wind. The abundance of sun, water, and wind are not necessarily equal in all areas, but collectively over a big region, you have water, wind, and solar power that can work effectively. This is why collaboration between countries is important, because you might have to use multiple power systems optimally over various regions to give power to the entire region. So for example, in Zambia, you have a lot of sun, but you might not necessarily have a lot of wind. So Namibia has lots of wind coming off the ocean and is not landlocked on its eastern border. A country like Zambia is landlocked with water in the center with Victoria Falls. Botswana is a country that's landlocked, has lots of sun, not a lot of water around, and not necessarily a lot of wind. But Namibia may be able to use a lot in the hydroelectric. Zambia might be able to use a lot in the solar. Some of those areas might be able to do wind, but if they collaborate together, they might be able to create a power system that uses multivariate technologies over the whole region to supply power. So when we talk about cooperation, it's got to be that spirit that we're not just collaborating just for the point of being friends. Yes, we want to do that to reach who we are as people, but also for the greater good, we can solve problems that face us collectively by realizing that we are from a common core, regardless of our spreading out, and then we work from that premise.
So, but this is why I asked you, and then I'm just going to raise this issue one more time, and then I just have one more question for us to wrap up with. This is why I raised the question to you all in advance of our discussion today about particularly the names of Nkrumah and Cheikh Anta Diop. So Nkrumah made the same exact point in his time, and this is why he was arguing for a United States of Africa. And as I understand it, the point was that we can't just have Ghana being free. We have to overthrow all of these colonial boundaries and create something or recreate something brand new. So again, this is why I brought up with you all before our discussion today the names of Kwame Nkrumah and Cheikh Anta Diop, and because to the points that you're raising, this is what I understood Nkrumah to be arguing as to why we needed a United States of Africa, and why it needed to be, as he was calling it, scientifically socialist, so that there could be a planned redistribution of the wealth created by Africans for Africans. And overthrowing colonial borders and all the boundaries that were created by Europeans to benefit Europeans. Mm-hmm. And this is, again, why I understood what Diop was doing in a book that for all the love he gets in the African world, this book seems to get under-discussed, that the cultural unity of a federated state. And his point, bringing in, understandably, some of those Marxist tendencies that he did deal with. But his point was, again, we need to have something that will overthrow the colonial boundaries, we have to have a political movement that's going to accompany any cultural movement that would allow us to have political power over a new state apparatus, a federated state, so we can do the things that you're talking about doing. Whereas in the world we're currently constituted, does not allow for that. We don't, these arrangements can't be made. They can't be brokered as the states are currently constituted, and as the absence of a militant Pan-African movement still prevails. So that's where I was wondering where those ideas and those people figured in your own analyses in this book, and how we can to get to the point that you're raising. I mean, because it can't currently happen in this arrangement.
Well, if you look at Kwame Nkrumah, I know you're talking about the one Africa, getting rid of all borders, and people like Julius Nyerere of Tanzania kind of wanted a more gradual approach where, he kind of looked at blocks of regions that had, similar histories, and let's get those together. But it's nothing wrong with the gradualism and getting regions together. And it's nothing wrong with the end goal of being one. The whole idea is that we need to start with just cooperation, period. I'll give you an example of something. See, cooperation has got to be just at the heart of it. There are lots of people from different countries who don't know anything about people in the next door neighbor. Language, partitions, all kinds of things. Recently, the president of Ghana took a trip to Zambia. Now, it seems to be a very historic happening. It shouldn't be, but let's say it's a historic happening. Why is that? Because Ghana and Zambia are not in the same geographical region, though both have been Anglophone colonized. Okay, so that means that there has to be an outreach to various nations who are not in the geographical sector. Okay, that kind of activity right there is linking two peoples who might not know much about each other. Now, one of the things we deal with in the book, and I know we're short on time to deal with this, but we talk about the term Bantu, meaning people or humans, which is a word or a variant of a word that is found in over 1,000 African languages. Why is this important? Because this is a kind of a Pan-African connector for Black people at the socio-cultural level beyond current borders, geographies, dispersal locations, inclusive of the diaspora. So the idea that we want to foster a relationship, a discussion amongst people who might not know who each other is, if we can just have those kinds of conversations, we can sort of move forward. So I'm saying lots of ideas on Pan-Africanism has been given, and all of them are valid. I'm just saying, let's take practical steps just to move it forward. There's no reason why, for example, any of the HBCUs, or a lot of them, can't offer Swahili as a course. Just for us to understand who we are as people all over the globe. There's no reason why the history of African people in the United States can't be put into the curriculum in schools in Nigeria, schools in Ghana, schools in the Congo, just so we learn more about one another. It will be amazing.
So let me ask you this, because this was actually the last question I wanted to end with, and maybe I should have started with. Why is it important for a Black woman or man in the United States, or an Afro-Latina or Latino or Latinx in the Caribbean or Latin America, why is it important that they have a connection to the African continent? And then similarly, why is it important for those on the African continent or directly from the continent itself to have a connection with the diaspora? Why is that? I know you've been addressing it and have somewhat already answered this, but if you could just take a quick moment and say specifically, sure, why are these Pan-African linkages so important?
Well, they're important because, number one, we are a family that has various tentacles, has had various languages, has had various different ethnic affiliations, even before the partition of Africa colonially. All right, now with the dispersion of various African people over the globe due to Arab and European slave trades, then we still need to come back together as a matter of strengthening the family, because we still need each other. Now, just to address the one side of it in terms of the diaspora, particularly the African American population, one of the most important components for empowerment, I believe, for African Americans, and indeed much of the rest of the diaspora outside the continent, is for us to be able to walk in Africa simultaneously as we walk in the United States. See, if people who don't have a particular homeland may not get respected because they're not anchored in other places. So this would be important for the African Americans, but we have a lot to give each other. And because we have a lot to give each other, the coming together of this can create linkages that empower both. So just on the issue of the history piece, I don't think that around the globe we know each other's history. I was hearing some type of other show in which a lady from Zambia was being interviewed, and the brother who was interviewing her asked, well, how much do people on the continent, you think, know about African Americans or about the slave trade? And she said that in the schools, she said maybe there's about a page in one of the history books, just simply mentioning slavery and just simply mentioning, oh, there are other African people in other places, but not a thorough discussion. Can't we transfer knowledge about ourselves just on that basis? Because once we begin to know more about each other, we begin to feel the pain of each other. I also wanted to say that, you know, even activating the 7 major areas of culture for us, which are what? Social organization, history, mythology. I haven't written down mythology, ethos, economic organization, political organization, creative motif. Just even trying to activate those things is going to be the basis of our human rights. Pan-African development is going to be cast forward, and it is going to strengthen our human rights initiatives once we realize that cooperating with ourselves, and I'm saying ourselves as one word, meaning we are a family historically that has been fragmented, that needs to be re-put back together. It doesn't mean it's going to be a perfect fit, but we're trying to move back to some semblance of connectedness. Once we create that idea about connectedness, then we can put our minds together and say, well, this is important. Do we know about one another? Why is it important for us to know about one another? Are we not the same people at the core root, regardless of the different languages that we speak? And so I'm saying all of the ideas and all of the persons that have on the world scene talk about Pan-Africanism, all the ideas are great. I just think we just need to move forward in simple ways with what we can do. Now, you mentioned we don't have any resources. Again, when people hear that, they say, yeah, I guess we don't. We're poor here, we're poor there, poor in the so-called material aspect. But is not our history rich? Do we not have the ability to communicate? You and I are communicating in 2 different areas. Simple technology to communicate. We're discussing ideas. I told you that the book Uwenzi itself is a testament to Pan-Africanism. We had to move around money to get the book done, to put together even a small little account, collectively, so that, whatever sales of the book, could go to an account collectively. That means trust, moving around money, time, efforts, etc. It can be done. And we wanted to make this book a testament to that idea. So resources, again, can be even the exchange of history. Can we not do that?
All right, Dr. Katembo, we're going to have to leave it there. I appreciate you taking the time to join us. Again, the book is called Uwenzi, The Pan-African Factor, a 21st Century View, co-authored by our guest today, and along with Drs. David Akombo and Kemet Shockley. Again, Dr. Katembo, thank you very much for joining us and having this important discussion. We appreciate you taking the time. Okay, thank you so very much. And for the rest of you, thanks for joining us. And as Fred Hampton used to say, to you we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody, and we'll catch you in the whirlwind. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.